Even now, many books and countless films have been created about the Vikings, but they are all still encased in a romantic halo. Here, the Vikings established many strange, if not terrifying, traditions from the viewpoint of modern men. And now we will tell you about the Vikings and their customs and rituals. Many Scandinavians migrated elsewhere to seek their fortunes between 800 and 1100. The Vikings, often known as the Norsemen, attacked British coastal settlements, particularly unguarded monasteries. They were pirates, raiders, traders, and settlers in a lot of Britain, Europe, Iceland, Greenland, and Newfoundland over the following 3 centuries. Contrary to what is commonly believed, the Vikings were not a race united by a shared history or sense of nationalism. The most well-known Vikings originated in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, while historical accounts also refer to Sami, Finnish, and Estonian Vikings. They were not civilized in the local sense from a foreign country, and most importantly, they were not Christians. You will get to know this and plenty more in this video, so stay tuned with us till the end of this video. However, before that, here's a quick reminder that you can subscribe for free and like the video so that you can boost your algorithm. Comments are most welcome. Morals and lifestyle. In spite of the frequent raids, the Vikings indulged in farming, hunting, and fishing in their free time. In contrast to many other peoples at the time, the Vikings had exceptional traditions and customs. As an illustration, any transactions could be made by only saying the word. This was sufficient. Nowadays, it is difficult to fathom that breaking a word or an oath, such as lying, could result in death, on par with crimes like murder and theft, which would have meant that old breakers and liars would have drowned in the river. Such people were thought to be in a perpetual state of misery in the Scandinavian afterlife, where they would drown day after day in the waters of the underground river of Scandinavian hell, according to Viking beliefs. The Vikings believed it was improper to talk about a kindred person's sorrow unless the person specifically requested assistance. People who were angry were generally not worthy of a Viking, and Vikings never got into arguments with them. A stranger must also never be made fun of since, according to the Scandinavians, mocking was always followed by a troll who would rip out the target's tongue. Additionally, the Vikings were extremely sensitive to the loss of their soldiers on the battlefield, hardly ever leaving them behind. The most intriguing aspect is that in this situation, the Valkyries scooped up the fallen warriors and transported them to the realm of Odin, because the only honorable death was one that occurred during combat. The souls of individuals who passed away at home and were elderly were transferred to another location, the goddess Helworld. It was especially unbecoming for a man to pass away in old age, since in that situation, the enemy would have every right to mock the victim for choosing an unmasculine method of passing away. Because of this, older Vikings urged their family members to carry out a ceremonial killing before they passed away. Procopius of Caesarea, for example, wrote about this. They weren't designed to make the elderly or sick people live longer, but rather once one of them passed away from an illness or old age, he had no choice but to request that his kin take him off the living as soon as possible. Then someone, but not one of his family, with a knife, would be sent to him after they had built a big high pile of firewood and placed this man on top of it. This person's murderer isn't meant to have any connection to him at all. When word of the murder of their kin reaches them, they set fire to the entire pile of wood, starting at the bottom. They gather the bones and instantly bury them in the dirt after the fire is put out. Male and female slaves. The goal of any invasion was to increase one's standard of living, and the fate of seized men and women might vary greatly. Many were taken prisoners solely in order to be released in exchange for a ransom. And if no ransom was anticipated, the slaves stayed at home. With the exception of artisans, who had a unique status, men performed the majority of the labor. Slaves had the legal right to marry, but only with their master's consent. Additionally, girls and women also assisted Viking wives at home because marriage was generally not seen as a family. Women slaves occasionally received very high positions in the Viking family, despite the fact that they had no rights, and some accompanied the Vikings on campaigns to satisfy any arising sexual cravings. It's odd that the Vikings themselves might end up as slaves. A debt, for instance, may be repurchased by his relatives if he was unable to pay off the debt, provided they could show that their own property was used to make the purchase. The transaction was deemed invalid, and all the slave's property passed to the master if it was used as a ransom. Aside from the fact that the master was accountable for the behavior of the slaves offspring were also treated as slaves from the minute they were born. For instance, if a slave killed someone, the master dealt with the victim's family. The slave's treatment subsequently received little attention. It is important to remember that the Vikings viewed the death of a slave as a dreadful dishonor, that can lead to blood vengeance from the slave's family against the slave's master. However, if we ignore these encounters, it becomes clear that the Vikings also made an effort to defend slaves, since they knew that not every battle would be lucky. 1. Excessive murders distorted the gender ratio. The raid on the Lindisfarne Monastery in northeastern England by Norwegian Vikings in 793 AD marked the start of the Viking Age. Up until 1066, the Vikings pounded the coastline of Europe. One hypothesis holds that the male-to-female ratio of the Vikings was skewed through gender-selective infanticide. According to several researchers, the Vikings did not primarily conquer Europe to plunder. They preferred spouses instead. DNA testing on contemporary Icelanders provides credence to this idea. They examined the mitochondria that you inherit from your parents. There hasn't been much immigration to Iceland since the Vikings first colonized there more than 1,000 years ago. As a result, researchers were able to pinpoint the origin of Iceland's settlers. They found that 63% of female settlers came from the British Isles, compared to 80% of male settlers who came from Norway. That would indicate that men and women from the Viking invasion zones in Norway frequently interbred. It seems unlikely that the women would have traveled alone to Iceland. 2. Soup as medicine. Viking women became knowledgeable about war wounds as a result of the gory and brutal fighting that was a part of their daily lives. Particularly, Viking women had a system for judging the seriousness of a knife or slash wound. The wounded warrior would make a stew of onions, leeks, and herbs. After eating it, the women would smell the wound. They thought the wound was too severe to be healed when they smelled the stew. The women refused to help the dying warrior be healed, since they knew that they were going to die. Only the warriors who could benefit from their treatment would receive their time and attention. 3. Holmgangs. The laws of the Vikings were very different from ours. It was forbidden to insult someone of high standing, yet it was occasionally acceptable to murder them. In a murder case, the killer might be killed by the family of the victim. Tribal wars broke out frequently as a result of this. Another technique for resolving disputes was holmgangs. The criminal organization known as the Holmgang was not founded by the actor Ian Holm. These fights sometimes resulted in fatalities. Someone who had been wronged by someone else challenged them to a duel. The battle had to be fought within a week of the challenge, though a stand-in challenge might be used if required. Before the fight started, the challenger would read the regulations, which varied depending on the location. The regulations specified who might initiate the first strike, how many shields were permitted, which weapon could be used, how the winner would be decided, and what the winner would receive. In certain cases, the holmgang could only be defeated by the death of one of the adversaries. If the challenged person did not show up for the duel, they were deemed guilty. Any member of society might theoretically justify murdering the accused if the offense was serious enough. As a result, if the clan chief skipped the duel, a slave may lawfully kill him. 4. Blood sports. Given the Vikings' passion for blood sports, their matches are more like ballet than UFC. Viking games were extremely risky and lethal. One of the activities they played was a swimming competition, albeit we use that term very loosely. To see how long one man could keep his opponent submerged was the object of the game. Men probably died because they couldn't escape to safety. In another game, two teams compete with a ball, in what essentially amounts to a full contact version of keep away. Despite its reputation for being bloody, the game was only played once a year, in the fall. The sport of wrestling was also highly valued in the culture of the Vikings. Even when they weren't actively robbing settlements, it helped them keep themselves in shape and prepared for combat. As if playing the games wasn't dangerous enough, brawls and fights may start at any time. On one account, a number of youngsters were playing a game. After being roughed up by another youngster during a game, a 6-year-old boy smashed an axe into his skull. If disputes weren't resolved on the pitch, they might turn into protracted blood feuds. Due to the level of violence present in the games, one warrior who is still capable of engaging in combat was compelled to watch from the sidelines. 5. Pagan sacrifices. Observing a blot on the winter solstice, the Arab adventurer Al-Tartucci described how they hold a festival at which everyone assembles to worship the deity and to eat and drink. On the winter solstice, spring equinox, summer solstice, and autumn equinox, this rite took place 4 times a year. At the farm's entrance, a sacrificed animal is set on stakes, and the person who killed it is in charge of removing the head. He must perform this for the benefit of his god, and so that everyone may see his sacrifice. While some gods only required material goods or money as tributes, others, most notably Odin, Lord of Valhalla, frequently required a living sacrifice in keeping with his status among the gods. At Onshold, a contraction of Odin's Holt, which means Odin's wood, there is substantial archaeological evidence that both animals and humans were hanged and bloodied for ritual sacrifice. The saga of Harald Fairhair's son, Håkon the Good, goes into considerable detail about a massive blot sacrifice. At a nearby temple, several animals, mostly horses, would be sacrificed, and their blood would be splattered on the spectators and the walls of the temple. The flesh was sacrificed, consecrated, and then devoured with gusto, while numerous toasts to the gods, starting with Odin, were made. A sacred tree in Uppsala, a Norse religious place, was decorated with a horse's blood according to the Hervarar saga. 6. The festival of Hestov, an awful duel between two stallions, is said to have started in Norway during the Viking Age, particularly in the Icelandic Commonwealth between 930 and 1262 CE. A center of Viking culture and society was Hestov. Horses in the wild compete for mates, and the Hestov is a man-made version of this. The competition revealed the horse's strength and distinguished the top horses for breeding. A ringed area was historically intended to prevent the stallion from escaping the confrontation, as would typically occur in nature when two stallions were introduced to a mare in heat. The mare would then be chained in the center of the enclosure, or occasionally outside, but still within the other horse's scent range to provoke competition among them for her. The horses would be startled or lashed into fighting if they resisted for any reason. The Hestov was believed to last anywhere from 15 minutes to more than 3 hours, with rounds added to break up the relentless animal savagery, and it typically ended with a participant being killed or seriously injured. 7. The terrifying Eric the Red. The Vikings were fierce warriors who were devoted to their cause and aggressive, but Eric Thorvaldsson was too vicious. Eric was born in Norway in 950, and his family moved to Iceland when he was a little child when his father was expelled for murder. Eric's nickname refers to his fiery personality and red hair. He would lose control of his temper about the year 980. In Haukadal, Iceland, Eric's workers produced a landslip that wrecked his neighbor's home. Eyjolf the Foul, the man's kinsman, executed the servants as retaliation. Eric killed Eyjolf and a clan enforcer out of rage. The relatives of Eyjolf demanded justice, therefore Eric was banished. Eric moved his family north, but they remained in Iceland. On Oxney Island, they developed a farm. Once they were set up, Fran the Dueler, a new neighbor, asked Eric if he might borrow some religiously significant wooden beams for his dwelling. Eric agreed, but Fran objected when he went to get them. 2 of Fran's sons and a number of his acquaintances were killed in the ensuing fight. Eric was once more banished. In Greenland, the earliest settlers were Eric and his family. After his exile was over, he went back to Iceland and persuaded others to travel to Greenland. Eric and his family moved into one of the 2 colonies, where they lived the rest of their time. About 500 years before Columbus, his son Leif Erikson was the first European to sail to North America and found colonies. 8. The Blood Eagle. Given the appalling conditions of Viking culture, it is hardly surprising that they are charged with inventing the blood eagle, one of the cruelest and most excruciating methods of execution. This method of execution involved tearing out the victim's lungs, which were then hung over his shoulders to give the appearance of wings via the gap left by the brutalization. Only twice of the known Norse tales feature the blood eagle, but other texts make references to it. Both victims were royals who were murdered by a son in retaliation for the death of their father, demonstrating that this method of execution was only used for those with special significance and goals. Halfdan Haleg, also referred to as Halfdan Longleg, was offered to Odin as a sacrifice by Torf Einar. Einar made them carve an eagle on his back with a sword, removed the ribs from the backbone and dragged the lungs thereout, and presented him to Odin for the victory he had won, he said. Ivar the Boneless executed La of Northumbria in 867 CE in retaliation for the murder of his father, the legendary Viking chieftain Ragnar Lodbrok, as described in the tale of Ragnar's sons. The account claims that after being taken into custody in York following a struggle, they carved the bloody eagle on the back of La. Then they took away all of the ribs from the spine, and then they ripped out his lungs. The Vikings certainly lived up to their reputation for brutality. In your opinion, the most disgusting thing that was normal for the Vikings?
But wrapped in a romantic halo, even today at the time of their existence. The Vikings, also referred to as the Norsemen, assaulted coastal settlements in Britain, especially vulnerable monasteries. Over the next 3 centuries, they were pirates, raiders, traders, and settlers in a lot of Britain, Europe, Iceland, Greenland, and Newfoundland. In today's video, we bring to you 10 disturbing facts about the Vikings. Our favourite is number 2. Let us know which is yours in the comments down below. 10. the sacrifice of children. Because of the writings of Christians, there was a persistent urban legend that Vikings practiced human sacrifice. The monks who were responsible for those texts, however, were never there during the actual ritual. The texts have been disregarded as being nothing more than propaganda. On the other side, there are writings that come from the Vikings that state humans are the ultimate sacrifice and that Odin purportedly ordered that they be offered to him. However, before 2011, there was no evidence that confirmed the Vikings engaged in human sacrifices, when human bones, as well as sacrifice jewelry and weaponry, were discovered at a site known for religious ceremonies in a Viking hamlet near Tis, Denmark. The site was located close to Tis. This finding helped to further support an earlier notion that was developed in response to the discovery of the skeletal remains of youngsters in a well. It is widely held that in dire circumstances, when the Vikings were attempting to re-establish contact with the gods, they would sacrifice children. 9. Viking soup. As a result of the often bloody and violent battles that were a normal part of Viking life, Viking women became quite informed about how to treat wounds sustained in combat. Specifically, Viking women had a method for determining the severity of a wound caused by a stab or a slash. They would give the hurt warrior a broth that contained onions, leeks, and various herbs in it. The women could smell the wound after they had eaten the meat. They understood that the wound was too deep if they smelled the broth, and there was no way to treat it. Since the ailing warrior was so close to passing away, the women refused to do anything to help him get well. They would only spend their time and use their medicines on those soldiers who could benefit from receiving them. 8. Magic mushrooms. Between the later part of the 8th century until the middle of the 11th century, the Vikings were the most powerful fighting force in Europe. When the Vikings went into battle, they would enter into a trance-like state known as berserker. This gave them a significant advantage over the people they invaded. When they were in this state, they would kill without discrimination everyone who stood in their way. The consumption of psilocybin mushrooms is suggested in certain writings as a possible explanation for how the Vikings achieved their berserker states, more commonly referred to as magical mushrooms. According to a hypothesis that was presented for the first time in the American Journal of Psychiatry, the mushrooms that were native to the region where the Vikings settled were responsible for their hallucinations. In addition to this, it caused an increase in their adrenaline levels, which led to their entering the berserker state. 7. Swords. The Vikings were skilled in the use of a variety of weapons, including long axes, spears, and swords. Even their shields were employed as weapons of offense by them. However, their long swords were considered to be their most cherished weapons. The Vikings gave their swords names like Widowmaker and Corpse Bramble, and they would pass them down from one generation to the next. When young Viking boys were growing up, their dads would tell them stories about all of the men in history who were killed by the sword. This assisted in the transmission of their family history and contributed to the installation of the concept of nobility in combat. The swords had 2 cutting edges and were so sharp that one cut could pass through the skull of a human being or amputate a limb with ease. The men slept with their swords next to them and carried them at all times, typically carrying them on their backs. It was required of men to be able to defend their homes and families, as well as assist in protecting their leaders and the property of their leaders. 6. Holmgang. The Vikings had a legal system that was quite different from the laws that are in place now. It is important to note that it was forbidden to offend someone of a higher class, but it wasn't always against the law to kill someone. For instance, if someone was murdered, the victim's family might be able to take revenge by killing the person who did it. This, of course, resulted in ongoing, vicious blood feuds that went back and forth between the two sides. No, a Holmgang was not a group of rowdy individuals who were devoted followers of the performer Ian Holm. They were battles, and some of them went all the way to the end. To all intents and purposes, it was a duel, with one person challenging another who, in his opinion, had wronged him. The fight was scheduled to take place within a week of the challenge, and anyone interested might sign up to compete in lieu of the person who issued the challenge. It was understood that the person who had been challenged was presumed to have accepted the bet, even if they did not show up for the fight. If the accusation was serious enough, then any person, regardless of their social standing, would be within their rights to kill the accused. This meant that if the chief of the clan didn't show up for a duel, a slave had the ability to murder him without facing any consequences from the law. 5. Blood Eagle. It is said that the Vikings practiced a particularly horrible method of death known as the Blood Eagle, and it appears that this method was reserved for members of the royal family. The victim was restrained with their head lowered. After that, the fun part actually started. On the back of the man would be engraved the image of an eagle with its wings spread wide in flight. After that, an axe would be used to carefully separate each individual rib from the spine. After that was finished, the bones and skin of the victim's back were peeled back to give the impression that they were wings. It is said that this took place while the victim was still conscious, which was necessary for the subsequent step, which consisted of rubbing salt into the wounds that were located on the victim's back. In order to put a stop to everything, the lungs were removed through the back. Observers were able to see the lungs release their final breath, which gave the impression that the wings were flapping as they did so. According to their texts, the Vikings carried out the practice of beheading at least twice throughout their history. This practice was reflected in the artwork of the Vikings. However, researchers working in the current day are uncertain as to whether or not the Blood Eagle was actually done, or whether it was merely a metaphor for what the individuals who were executed went through. 4. Infanticide. The people who lived in the Nordic region of Europe, where the weather can be quite severe and physical conflict was a regular part of life, instilled a sense of fortitude and bravery in their offspring by teaching them to fight and to use their weapons. Everyone, including youngsters, was expected to contribute to the household income in Viking culture. As they got older, it was expected of all males to fight, and it was expected of all ladies to work around the house, in addition to their other responsibilities. If a baby was born with a defect or whatever else went wrong with them, they were frequently abandoned outside where they would eventually die of exposure. 3. Slavery. It is generally accepted that the Viking Age began in 793 AD, when raiders, most likely from Norway, assaulted the Lindisfarne monastery located in the North Sea off the coast of northeastern England. Up until the year 1066, Vikings continued to plunder the monasteries and communities that dotted the coast of Europe. However, researchers have never been able to agree on a definitive reason for why the Vikings first began their raids. Because of gender-selective infanticide, there may have been an imbalance in the number of males to females during the time of the Vikings, which may have contributed to the men's desire for women. Because of this, a number of researchers have come to the conclusion that the primary reason Viking men began invading different regions in Europe was not to pillage the land. Instead, they concentrated their efforts on snatching women to raise as their children and marry. This hypothesis has been given credence by the results of genetic research carried out on contemporary Icelanders. The precise mitochondria that a person inherits from both their mother and their father were the ones that were examined. According to the results of their research, around 80% of Iceland's male settlers originated from Norway, whereas 63% of Iceland's female settlers originated from the British Isles. This would imply that there was widespread intermarriage between men and women of Norwegian descent, hailing from regions that had been conquered by Vikings. 2. Deadly games. Because the Vikings cherished bloodshed, it really shouldn't come as a shock that their games made the UFC appear like something out of the ballet. Death and major injury were both typical occurrences during Viking games. The men were free to leave the game at any time they pleased, as it was the regulation. They were to blame for their own deaths if they occurred. One of the games that they participated in was a swimming competition, although we use the term swimming in a fairly general sense. The purpose of the game was for the guys to see who could keep their opponents submerged for the longest amount of time. If the man was unable to swim to the surface, he was doomed to drown. Fights and brawls had the potential to break out at any time, even if the games themselves were not violent enough. According to one version of the story, a young child of 6 years old used an axe to attack another young boy because the other boy had roughed him up earlier in the game. 1. Eric the Red was too violent for the Vikings. The Vikings were renowned to be cruel warriors who were famed for their fierceness and dedication to their craft. The Vikings could not put up with Eric the Red's aggression. In addition to this, they felt that Eric Thorvaldsson possessed an excessive amount of physicality. He was born in Norway sometime around the year 950 and is better known by his nickname, Eric the Red. When Eric was a little boy, his family relocated to Iceland after his father was sentenced to exile for his involvement in a murder. This would end up being a recurring idea for Eric. He got the infamous nickname Redhead due to the colour of his hair, as well as the fact that he was a volatile and aggressive individual. Around the year 980, his servants caused a landslide, which ultimately led to the destruction of his neighbour's home. In an act of vengeance, the man's relative Eolf the Foul was responsible for the deaths of the servants. Eric was so enraged that he ended Eolf and one of his clan's enforcers' lives. It was decided to exile Eric. The family of Eric relocated to the north. They settled on the island of Oxney and established a farm there. Fran the duelist, a new neighbour who was in the process of constructing his home, approached Eric with the request to borrow some wooden beams. Even though Eric had agreed to it, Fran would not give them back to him when he went to fetch them. As a result of the fight that broke out, 2 of Fran's sons, in addition to several of his friends, were killed. When Eric and his family moved to Greenland, they were the pioneers who established the first permanent settlement there. Following the conclusion of his exile, he went back to Iceland and lobbied for the relocation of Icelanders to Greenland. 2 colonies were founded, and Eric and his family made their home in one of them for the remainder of their lives.